Good evening, everyone. If I may have your attention. I'm Katrina Rogers, president of Fielding, and it is a pleasure to see so many faces here on Friday evening at the end of a very long week. And we had rain this week and beautiful sunshine today, and we've had final oral reviews. And I just came from an alumni and new graduate reception in the bar area, and they were just so excited to be finally done. So for the students in the room, remember this too will be you soon, someday. And I'll stand at your graduation, as I said to them this evening. So I'm very pleased that Dr. Kramer said that I could come up and just welcome you all to this event and say once again how much I appreciate the Alonso Center for Psychodynamic Studies to keep not only the spirit of a dear faculty member, Ann Alonso, alive, but also to really continue to build and grow our awareness and understanding of psychodynamic studies and the relationship of psychodynamic theory, not just in Fielding in terms of helping our own students become clinicians that are immersed in this very humans relation oriented approach and humanistic approach, but also out there in the greater world. And for those of you who would like to be more involved in the Alonso Center and maybe don't know much about psychodynamic studies, do become a member. We're offering free membership to anybody who wants to become a member of the Alonso Center. And as a result of that, you'll be invited to webinars, and we'll just keep you in touch with sort of the latest happenings and so on. I'm also delighted to be here tonight to listen to Dr. Orange because she's going to talk to us about climate justice and psychotherapy. And as some of you may know, that my own research field is in environmental policy and also environmental leadership and the values that people hold related to climate change. So I think there's some really interesting parallels. But I'm now going to turn it over to Margaret to introduce our speaker. And welcome. Thank you for being here on behalf of our students.
Thank you, Katrina. It's my distinct honor tonight to introduce Dr. Donna Orange. Let me tell you a little bit about her. She was educated in philosophy, clinical psychology, and psychoanalysis. She teaches at the NYU postdoc in New York and at what's called IPSS, the Institute for the Psychoanalytic Study of Subjectivity, and in private study groups. Some of her recent books include, which you can see samples of up here, Thinking for Clinicians, Philosophical Resources for Contemporary Psychoanalysis and the Humanistic Psychotherapies, also The Suffering Stranger, Hermeneutics for Everyday Clinical Practice, Nourishing the Inner Life of Clinicians and Humanitarians, The Ethical Turn in Psychoanalysis, and Climate Justice, Psychoanalysis, and Radical Ethics. Her next project concerns hearing the voices of those silenced by history, by culture, and by ourselves. It's with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Donna Orange.
Thank you, Margaret. Okay, how's the sound? The room seems enormous to me. I see that you do it like church. You know, nobody wants to sit in the front row. But I understand that. I wouldn't be sitting in the front row either. So let me know if I back away from the mic and you have trouble hearing me. I am extremely interested in hearing problems, and in fact, my next book is going to be entitled Learning to Hear. I'm deaf in one ear. This happened to me suddenly in 2010. I do have a cochlear implant, and that helps me some. But the reason I'm telling you this is if you want to talk to me and I don't pay attention, it's that I didn't hear you. Please come around and talk into my good ear. I have one perfectly good ear, fortunately. Or as they would have said where I just came from in Vienna, Gott sei Dank. the background on this paper is that it goes with this book, which is already 3 years old, actually, I mean, from when I wrote it. You probably realize that the climate change story has not improved in that time, but has markedly worsened. Every day almost, I read or hear bad news. And the song to go with this is Leonard Cohen's You Want It Darker, his last song, if you want some music to go with this. And somebody from the next generation or 2 generations is here, and it's for your sake that we must be concerned about this. Absolutely. My talk is entitled Climate Justice and Psychotherapeutics. It addresses primarily my colleagues in psychoanalysis, but it really is for all of us who are interested in the psychotherapies, or what my friend Phil Cushman calls the PSY disciplines. When we're finished tonight on your way out, you can take a copy of this talk, so don't bother taking notes. Just listen up, and if you have something that you want to ask about, protest about, or add to what I'm saying, that you might want to make a note about. But you don't need to write down what I'm saying because you're going to have a copy. If I had known what your situation was and how hard you all have been working for a whole week already before I got here, I probably would have done more for you than I did. Okay, psychotherapists, though more alert now to our responsibility, let's see if I can make this thing tip down a little bit. Yeah. To our responsibility, psychotherapists, though more alert now to our responsibility to the world's most vulnerable people, more conscious of our solidarity with those who suffer, seem to be working largely in a bubble. Climate change has already, scientists tell us in the most urgent voices they can find, become an emergency, threatening to overwhelm all attempts to stem the primarily human-created disaster. Still, we psychotherapists work quietly and faithfully on, living as we always did, driving to work, flying to conferences, watering our lawns, eating and consuming mindlessly. Meanwhile, most political and financial leaders conspire to hide the ominous truths, no longer simply inconvenient, but dire, and we allow ourselves not to notice. Are we psychoanalysts who should perhaps do better, conspiring or colluding to sustain an environmental unconscious? Are we helping to silence the canary in the coal mine? Having received extensive education and training, including mandatory personal analysis to prepare us for our work, we have, I believe, also acquired responsibility to be leaders, moral if not scientific, in confronting the global crisis we are living. We possess the intellectual and communal resources to take on this responsibility. So far, however, we have been resoundingly silent. Where are the psychoanalysts, we who rightly or wrongly consider ourselves intellectual leaders in psychotherapy and in understanding human motivation? Perhaps we have learned nothing from the example of Sigmund Freud, who, blinded by his passion for his work, his love for Enlightenment German culture, and his need to be as important as Copernicus and Darwin, could not see that he and his Jewish family, as well as psychoanalysis itself, faced mortal danger in Vienna in the late 1930s. In another strange example, a few years later during the London Blitzkrieg, during one of the British Psychoanalytic Society's furious disputes about the origins of hatred and aggression, Donald Winnicott stood up and noted their actual effects. I should like to point out that there is an air raid going on, he said. Are we, too, so absorbed in our theories and worse in our theoretical and interdenominational disputes over who belongs and who does not, that we fail to notice the human-caused planetary warming, that it threatens to destroy the world within which we practice our beloved profession? We say that all is grist for the psychoanalytic mill, but what if this crisis threatens the survival of the mill itself? We psychoanalysts, together with our colleagues in other therapeutic areas, actually have a unique contribution to make in this crucial moment. We can help not only to refocus our own attention on the imminent threats to our own way of life, but to the world's most vulnerable people and to the earth which supports us all. In the best psychoanalytic tradition, we can notice the forms of historical unconsciousness, the still walking ghosts of the narrative unconscious, keeping us insensitive to the suffering in which we are implicated and to whom we are responsible, the suffering ones. We can call out the more selfish of the defenses that keep us avoidant and name the forms of traumatic shock that keep us too paralyzed to respond and to respond appropriately. We can help with the processes of mourning, not only the remembered ways of life, but also the loss of many kinds of hope and certainty for the future. Learning from Latin American climate justice leaders, from First Nations leaders in Canada and elsewhere, we can ask ourselves and each other, including our patients, what really matters in times of crisis, thus responding more creatively than our analytic forebears did. But we have no time to waste. In Bill McKibben's words, there is no longer any long haul. So first there is the science. Everything I say here about the science is already outdated. The newest reports from the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, say that the situation is far worse than what I'm going to tell you here, and far more urgent. Emergency situations require immediate response. With ever-increasing intensity, climate scientists, the IEA, the IPCC, NOAA, although NOAA, of course, can't work now because the government's shut down, warn us that the warming of our oceans and atmosphere is increasing far faster than they had predicted even 5 or 10 years ago. And that we will probably reach very soon, and may already have reached, tipping points at which the damage to the earth and its biological inhabitants will be not only irreversible, but unmanageable. NOAA reports that July 2015 was the hottest month on record. 2015 was the hottest year on record. Now, this has been a series of years, each one hotter than the one before. The summer ice cap has nearly disappeared from the Arctic, while the West Antarctic ice sheet is slipping into the ocean and breaking off. More and more species are already becoming extinct at a rate more than 100 times the background rate, reports Paul Ehrlich of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. While human life rapidly degenerates into the war of all against all, announced by philosopher Thomas Hobbes in the 18th century. I'll just show you one small thing. The British newspaper, The Guardian, which maybe some of you read, this week published an article called Insect Collapse. We are destroying our life support systems. A scientist went to Puerto Rico to a huge nature preserve where there hasn't been fossil fuels coming in, and they haven't cut down the trees, and they haven't, it hasn't been messed with like the Amazon and so many other places. What they found out was that 95% of the insects are gone. Now, that's dangerous, and it's alarming. And the speculation is that it's because of warming, of warmer atmosphere. I made about 5 or 6 copies of this article, and that'll be first come, first served. But look it up if you're interested in this online. This is one of the many, many types. This just came this week, but every day or every other day, we're getting news like that from somewhere. Extremes of economic inequality, evident both within the USA and worldwide, though some consider them a separate problem, cannot, many of us believe, be addressed apart from the climate emergency. We must consider the ways social justice and climate change intricately intertwine to form the question of climate justice. The IPCC goes on to predict, based on multiple modeling, the foreseeable future, whether we do or do not make radical changes in the way we are living. They assume that significant mitigation, that is, reducing the carbon, beginning to bring our carbon usage down to a 2 degrees centigrade atmospheric warming in this century, could keep the damage within adaptable limits. Many people think that that is an overly optimistic estimate, and the newer IPCC report no longer says that. It paints a much darker picture. But IPCC emphasizes that risks are unevenly distributed and are generally greater for disadvantaged people and communities in countries at all levels of development. So the poorest people are already suffering from this and are going to suffer more. They're the ones who will be displaced from wherever they've been living and have no resources to go somewhere else. It's already that way. Many observers consider the IPCC's alarming account so carefully worded based on the 2 and 4% centigrade warming as too conservative. A 2% goal reachable only if we stop putting carbon into the atmosphere almost immediately, converting to renewable sources of energy by 2030, still leaves us on a path to irreversible damage requiring major adaptations, like moving away from the coasts, for example, and changing the whole agricultural production. Doing nothing about carbon, which is essentially what we've been doing and continuing to do, means at least a 4% warming before the end of this century with extremely probable catastrophic effects. Now, what they're saying now is that we are on a road to catastrophic effects within the next 10 years now. Now it's no longer the end of the century. It's within the next 10 years. And if you think about the extreme kinds of weather events that we've all been experiencing in the last 3 years, you can see if this is concatenating, this is alarming. Meanwhile, the more conservative but still very worried IPCC concludes that even under optimal conditions of mitigation, That is, radical reductions in carbon from transport and all forms of energy production, and methane, mostly from fracking and livestock raising emissions. Limiting warming to a 2 degrees centigrade, significant climate changes already underway will require major adaptations, especially to protect the most vulnerable people. Whole island populations are already relocating in the face of rising sea levels, while refugees from famine and war are already pouring into Europe. Without radical changes away from fossil fuels, including substantial decreases in consumption, initiated immediately, warming of 4 degrees is both extremely probable, and they emphasize, and will make our planet uninhabitable by the end of this century. And I say many are saying much sooner than that. Like the IEA, the IPCC warns that every level, world, regional, national, subnational, local, must make radical changes immediately to avoid the direst consequences. Now, I know that you all know this. It's just that sort of hearing it all together leads me where I need to go next. They also tell us that the changes are still possible, including a complete change from fossil fuels by 2030, but will require vast mobilization of the world's richest countries, those who have contributed the most to the problem. When I wrote this, the Obama administration had announced the strongest regulations to limit coal-fired power plants to date. Of course, we know what's happened to all of that. Yet, most of us go on just as if we had not heard the warnings. Are our brains simply wired to exclude bad news, as George Marshall believes? Are we in the grip of environmental melancholia, as social scientist, reader of Psychoanalysis, Renee Lertzman thinks? You will have all these names when you get the paper. Or frozen by climate trauma, as I have sometimes wondered. Or have we inherited a philosophical egoism, wedded to a narcissistic mindset full of entitlement, perhaps even of unconscious racist privilege inherited from millennia of slavery, trapping and immobilizing us? All of these may be true, but if the disciplines of philosophy, history, and psychoanalysis can help us to identify our problem quickly, then perhaps alliance with the world's moral and religious leaders can begin to shift the political tide, to create a tipping point of solidarity to meet the carbon tipping points already looming. Now, there are some days when I take that more optimistic point of view. And then there are other days when I'm listening to people like Jem Bendell. I don't know if any of you have been reading him. He's known for a paper called Deep Adaptation, Psychology in the Face of Climate Tragedy, or something like that. In any case, he's essentially suggesting that what we in the Psy disciplines need to do now is to prepare people, help people to mourn the loss of our planet, and to help us to approach our end in as humanistic a spirit as we can. So what you find when you talk to the climate psychology people is that all of us are going back and forth between that point of view that says our job now is to help people prepare for the end. Sort of like you got a cancer diagnosis and you want to decide, should I fight it or should I accept it and prepare for my end? And some people seem to manage to do both at the same time. but it's in some ways, it's a similar kind of question. And I put it in these stark terms because I think that's what it needs. It's much worse than when I started writing about this 3 years ago. We must also acknowledge that the climate crisis affects us humans unequally, that some of us are still reasonably comfortable, while many and increasingly a large majority remain hungry, homeless, and destitute. Some of us have far more coping resources than do our brothers and sisters across the tracks or across the world. Some of us can move away from rising water and famine and away from wars. We might say with Emmanuel Levinas, phenomenologist and prophet whose radical ethics I'll bring up later, that to respond ethically, we must allow ourselves to be traumatized, to be taken hostage by the useless suffering of these others. From the Talmud, he quoted, "To leave men without food is a fault that no circumstance attenuates. The distinction between the voluntary and the involuntary does not apply here," he wrote. In other words, not knowing that my lifestyle creates starvation and misery for others is no excuse. The fault remains. Thus, climate justice theorists speak of carbon debt that polluters like us owe to those whose health and survival continues to be destroyed by our way of life, whether we know it or not. Levinas commented, "Before the hunger of men, hunger is measured only objectively. It is irrecusable." He often quoted from Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, "We are guilty, responsible of all and before all, and I more than all the others." Double-mindedness, even when traumatically induced, does not exonerate. It simply leads to, "We didn't know anything," from people who saw their neighbors loaded into boxcars and taken away. We too are pretending to ourselves not to know, especially how our lives of privilege impoverish and endanger our fellow human beings. But traumatically paralyzed, we may not notice our guilt and responsibility, or we may feel so overwhelmed by the outsized proportions of this crisis that we cannot imagine where to begin, and we find ourselves just going on as before. Robert Stollerow, my old colleague, speculates about the resulting avoidance. He says, "An explanation of the evasion perhaps requires a shift from a philosophical to a psychoanalytic perspective, emphasizing the unbearable emotions that would accompany a facing up to a doomsday scenario with its collapse of meaning. It is from the horror of this doomsday scenario posed by climate change that the minimizers, scoffers, and ridiculers turn away," he writes. Ironically, in turning away from the extreme dangers of climate change, we contribute to the coming to be of the horrifying catastrophe we are evading. We must face up to our apocalyptic anxiety before it is too late for the survival of future generations. Such facing up requires that we open a far-reaching emotional dialogue in which the angst can be collectively held and borne. Bob is surely right, but how are we to organize a far-reaching emotional dialogue in such a short time? The fierce urgency of now, Martin Luther King's expression, worries many of us. By the time we wake up, millions more of the world's poorest will have died from hunger, and global warming's worst effects may be irremediable. We will need the holding dialogue in any case to help us mourn while bearing anxieties that otherwise paralyze us. Now, my next section is called Historical Consciousness and the Invisible Present, Settler Colonialism and Slavery. Unconscious and silent about the U.S. history of settler colonialism, ignorant and mute about our crimes of chattel slavery and racial domination, neither governments nor citizens can seriously tackle climate injustice until we confront this 400-year history. This is my thesis. It's the central thesis of my little book here. It accuses the me, ever guilty and responsible, but locates the problems in a shared historical and narrative unconsciousness, in a we. So let us imagine another crowd of ghosts inhabiting our ethical unconsciousness. Hans Lowald, contemporary Freudian who died in 1992 or so, said famously that the unconscious is a crowd of ghosts. So we're imagining another crowd of ghosts inhabiting our ethical unconsciousness. Though intellectual ghosts may live to cause trouble, think of Descartes and Locke, now let us consider the historical unburied crimes, our collective ghosts, though largely unconscious, of settler colonialism and chattel slavery in the Americas, and especially in the United States, founded on an explicit ideal of human equality. I choose colonialism and slavery because of our habits of keeping these crimes, genocides before the term came to usage after World War II, hidden from ourselves. This may be also keeping us unaware of the impacts of climate change on people who live out of our daily sight. The history of North America, from where I write, begins with two nations, England and France, competing to rule a land allegedly empty of human beings, according to the doctrine of terra nullius, first invoked by the Spanish and Portuguese. It means that the land is empty of humankind, so we can have it. Then came the young United States with its manifest destiny, and by an expansive Canada, destroying the indigenous peoples. Canada, it seems, has recently attempted much greater acknowledgement of its First Nations than we have done in the United States, where we name them Native Americans, oblivious to the preference of most for being called by their tribal names or simply Indians. By the way, when I speak in Toronto, for example, before I begin, the convener always says, we are gathered this day or this evening on the land of the Haudenosaunee and other groups which they name. And the children in school hear this as an announcement every morning before they start their studies, that they are living and studying on the land that belongs to these native peoples. I've never heard that done in this country. Settler colonialism does not simply manage colonies, as Britain did in India, arrogant as this process may be, but replaces the peoples living there, as in Australia and New Zealand, Canada, and what became the United States, as if the beings living there were not fellow human beings whose lives mattered at all. Judith Butler would say that these lives had been treated as ungrievable. Calling ourselves a nation of immigrants, we do not even notice their loss. Chattel slavery names the system, including in particular the African slave trade of the 15th through the 19th centuries, of claiming to own, buy and sell, inherit, and force to work, usually by extreme violence, human beings. Other forms of slavery, including those practiced by the Nazis and in the Soviet gulags, as well as forms of child labor, sex slavery, and so on, these are unspeakably reprehensible, and which Ta-Nehisi Coates now confronts us. Writing to his son, he reminds us, enslavement is not a parable. It is damnation. It is the never-ending night. And the length of that night is most of our history. Never forget that we were enslaved in this country longer than we have been free. Never forget that for 250 years, Black people were born into chains, whole generations followed by more generations who knew nothing but chains. Actually, we might consider whether Europe and North America, especially we in the United States, suffer from a superiority complex. Symptoms of such a complex might include: 1, the presumption that we own land stolen from indigenous peoples who lived upon it communally just because we bought it from people who owned it before us. 2, the presumption that the ways we who think ourselves white do things are the right ways. 3, the presumption that others worldwide should learn English, while we have no obligation to learn Spanish or other widely spoken languages. 4, a general insensitivity to our own arrogance and sense of superiority, easily degenerating into violence against those we consider inferior. 5, an incapacity to imagine ourselves into the predicament of those to whom we feel superior, thus a blunting of empathy and compassion. And 6, a sense that the earth belongs to us, the so-called whites, and that others, they, exist to serve our economic interests, to mine the minerals we want or need, to make us cheap clothes, to work at below poverty wages, and so on. This complex, superiority complex, with its embedded assumptions, largely unconscious and invisible, forms a web of life, to use, the philosopher's name is escaping me, generating comfort among those who carry it and creating death and fury among those we dominate. We do not know that we suffer from it in our fundamental humanity. And my next section is called Psychoanalysis and Double-mindedness. By double-mindedness, however, I mean something much more problematic than mere denial. Double-minded, we live in two realities at once. We know about the climate crisis and perhaps even that it is rapidly becoming dire. But in a mental gesture akin to throwing up our hands, we say, this is too big for me or for any individual. Only systemic changes matter. So we go on working with our patients and our psychoanalytic politics as humanistically as we know how to work, while our common home becomes a burning world. And nobody in California needs to wonder what we're talking about. Essentially, we, like Freud in the 1930s, and like the millions of ordinary Germans in the period studied by Thomas Kohut and others, we have disabled the fire alarm. To accomplish this, as we shall see, we have taught ourselves not to see those worst affected as human, just like ourselves, as others whose suffering matters. How are we doing with the time? We're okay on the time, aren't we? Yeah. We could spend chapters, articles, and books asking how this happens. A vast literature on multiple types of dissociation and Freudian repression this literature is available to us. More immediate, and you know it from your clinical work, those of you who are clinicians. More immediately useful might be to ask how, faced with crisis, we living daily in our professional minds with these concepts might emerge rapidly to protect our common home. Will our theories help us enough? Surely they have not until now. Or do we need something else to shake us out of our analytic slumbers? Speaking to psychoanalysts who often characterize ourselves as not belonging to the STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, but to the tellers of stories. Philosopher Judith Butler writes, "But what if the narrative reconstruction of a life cannot be the goal of psychoanalysis, and that the reason for this has to do with the very formation of the subject? If the other is always there from the start, in the place where the ego will be, then a life is constituted through a fundamental interruption, is even interrupted prior to the possibility of any continuity." She's alluding to a lot of things here. You know, Freud's saying where the id was, the ego shall become, and things like that. And she's saying, what if there's an interruption by the other in that process? What if it's not all about me? My guess is that we cannot see, cannot feel this prior interruption of the other, primarily because we are so embedded in the cultures that have created the climate problem. As many have noted, Freud grew up intellectually in and was deeply attached to the Enlightenment and Romantic European culture that enshrined individual autonomy as the ultimate good. We psychoanalysts and most psychotherapists have inherited Freud's deep assumptions, along with a certain blindness to threats to the common good. Additionally, attached to these old cultures, in part because of the traumatic background of contemporary psychoanalysis, that is, most of my teachers in psychoanalysis, as any of you who trained in the East, and some here in Los Angeles, were taught by Holocaust survivors. So there's a real strong traumatic background in our world. This creates a desperate need for home, and with this, we may have forgotten the other destitute homeless of the world, in particular of the Southern Hemisphere. We're starting to talk a lot more about climate refugees, that the refugees are from violence, in many cases, that's been very much impelled by climate change. I'm told that there was a fearsome drought in Syria for 5 years before the war that's now gone on for the last 4 years began. Those millions of people are obviously war refugees, but they're also climate refugees. We need a contextualist analysis of our double-mindedness and a radical ethic to shake us out of it. Climate shame, one form of this double-mindedness, takes, I believe, two principal forms, intricately interrelated. One, the fear of visible vulnerability that keeps us indifferent to the nature and extent of the crisis. And two, continuing envy of those who have more, so that those deprived of essential needs become invisible. In our striving, we reach for more space, larger houses and cars, more things, perfect bodies that resist or growing or appearing old. Entangled together, these two aspects of shame feed self-enclosed preoccupation. I wrote one time a big paper about shame and envy, and it always makes me think about the fact that if I'm walking down the street behind you and you've got on a beautiful coat or a gorgeous pair of shoes, I all of a sudden think that I have to have that. You know, that something's wrong with me because I don't dress as well as you do, and so on. So the shame and envy are so tangled up together, these emotions. Some people say they're just two sides of the same coin. Entangled together, these two aspects of shame feed self-enclosed preoccupation, utterly distracting us from the descriptions and warnings of the best climate science. Without the fundamental experience of being held and cherished, We lack the emotional sense of belonging among other human beings or anywhere. Then we treat our world and implicitly ourselves too like disposable garbage. The second feeling that to go with the shame, envy, attempts to restore an ersatz well-being, to cover up the rotten sense of shame with money, fame, and glamour. Any sense that others have more occludes our ethical vision. You know, when I'm worrying about that coat, that beautiful coat you have, that I can't think about the other who has no coat at all. Any sense that others have more occludes our ethical vision, blinding us to our involvement in injustice and deafening us to the cries of those we are harming every day. Much less can we, envious of those who have more, notice that we in the first world live as beneficiaries of massive injustices perpetrated by our colonialist ancestors on the indigenous first peoples in the Americas, Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere, as well as on prosperity. We live on prosperity originally created by systems of human bondage, also called slavery. For this unconsciousness to fade or to wake up morally, we would need that indispensable and painful moral form of shame, awareness of our implication in systems of evil, to replace the shame and envy that traps us in compulsive consuming. Just as psychoanalytic treatment of shame begins to restore to the mistreated a sense of inclusion in the human community, so can a psychoanalytic sensibility, sensitive to the corrosive and isolating effects of shame, begin to link us all with each other. We can begin to understand that our well-being depends on the well-being of others. Ubuntu, they say in South Africa, solidarity, and restore the old notion of the common good. And we're getting toward the end, but the last section is about radical ethics and politics. Inverting all standard ethical accounts, ethics as optics, by which we mean ethics as capacity to see the suffering of the other. Ethics as optics upends moral reasoning by starting from the suffering other, invading my self-satisfied life, not from the putative moral agent. Emptied of ego by a pre-originary responsibility, I am commanded by the other's starvation. William Edelglass provides a compact argument for what I am calling a radical ethics of climate change. He writes, because Levinasian ethics begins in and ever returns to the suffering other, the suffering of those whose lives are negatively impacted by climate change rupture all arguments that justify or justify neglecting individual greenhouse gas emissions. Levinas acknowledges that in nourishing ourselves, we take food that can feed others. And it's something that we have to think about. Somewhere Levinas wrote that any attempt to justify the suffering of the other is obscene, is just morally obscene. So when we start explaining to ourselves why people are responsible for their own suffering, we're getting into moral obscenities. In other words, my irrecusable responsibility to the vulnerable and suffering other does not go away just because I need to drive or fly somewhere. I drove here, I was hours in the car today driving here from Claremont. Nor is it lessened because this vulnerable other ekes out a bare existence in the southern hemisphere less visible to me. Philosopher Robert Bernasconi writes, a hungry child in a distant land is no longer out of our reach. If globalization means living in a world in which the terms far and near stranger, and neighbor no longer have the same meaning for us as they once did because everyone is now recognized as within the same circle, then the hunger of the most marginalized members of the global society must become its fundamental reference point. The hunger of the most marginalized members of the global society must become its fundamental reference point. The other's precarious life, Judith Butler, again, questions me, accuses me, persecutes me. A close consequence of this endless responsibility links it to the political. There is no place, writes Bernasconi, for an ethical discourse that is not also inextricably linked with recognition of the political context that it is its task to interrupt. He explains that experiences of persecution link us to others enslaved, impoverished, homeless, in solidarity. Watching the thousands of families seeking shelter in Europe in 2015, those who remember their own suffering may be better able to respond. Instead, oblivious to the causes of the suffering that brings children and adults to our southern border in the US, we compete to boast about who can build the largest and most robust wall against them. Most of us, unless affected by tornadoes, hurricanes, and wildfires, have no memory of this kind of suffering. When the sufferers look much like us, perhaps white and even affluent, we rush to help them rebuild. But many of those devastated by hurricanes like Katrina are already poor or dark-skinned, so we treat them just as we treat the refugees. How do we come to see them as our brothers and sisters? Can memory, either of our own suffering or of past courage and generosity, begin to activate us in the nick of time? In Harold Westfall's words, conscience need not make cowards of us all. It can make us brothers and sisters. This radical ethics of response to the other implies disrupting massive political injustice when we are able to see it. It means that others' suffering persecutes me, takes me hostage, requires substitution, one for the other. It demands hospitality to people displaced by war, poverty, and terror. Even if we cannot speak their languages, we can see their desperate faces. We must remember. In our own history, we can remember quiet activists sitting at segregated lunch counters, sitting in the front of segregated buses, disrupting injustice. Now we find Indigenous peoples of Canada, the USA, and elsewhere sitting down to close the roads to tar sands drilling equipment. But we need more than only the persecuted to stand in solidarity against injustice. How do we find our ethical bones? Even when the photo of the drowned 3-year-old refugee on a Mediterranean beach stops us for a moment in our tracks, how do we keep our ethical imagination awake, determined that a world in which some lives are regarded as expendable cannot continue? We need an ethic that arises from these extreme situations because we face one now. Let us hear these words, and these are from Emmanuel Levinas, who, for those of you who don't know him, is a philosopher who himself spent the 5 years of World War II in a concentration camp, a labor camp. He says, justice remains justice only in a society where there is no distinction between those close and far off, but in which there also remains the impossibility of passing by the closest. The equality of all is borne by my inequality, the surplus of my duties over my rights. The forgetting of self moves justice. I like that sentence. The forgetting of self moves justice. In addition, philosopher J. Aaron Simmons argues convincingly that we face what he calls a meta-ethical emergency. A situation like that facing Britain in 1939, as it considered whether the ordinary laws of war still applied in facing an imminent threat to all civilized life. That we confront, Simmons claims, the looming destruction of a livable world means we do not have the leisure for non-anthropocentric ethics concerned equally for all species. Now, this is a big argument among climate people. We must, he believes, immediately prioritize the most vulnerable humans suffering from the effects of climate change if we are to have any chance of motivating the type, extent, and rapidity of change needed. Ordinary ethics such as the duty and utilitarian ethics that I've also written about, including deep ecology perhaps, belong to everyday life. In the context of a meta-ethical emergency, writes Simmons, there is no time to advocate theories that do not have a good enough chance of motivating a reasonable public response to the crisis. We have to treat our current situation as an extreme humanitarian emergency, not something to measure against competing ideals and philosophies. Paraphrasing Simmons, emergencies call for a kind of ethical triage that he calls a hierarchy of ethical political significance. That's too much jargon for me, so I say triage. William Edelglass, in the same vein, writes that Levinas provides a way of understanding how the singular subject's moral responsibility is the condition for the possibility of collective responsibility. In other words, we each have to take it on if we're going to all take it on. Response to the face of the suffering sister and brother creates political change through prophetic action. We notice a missing shame in Cain's insolent response. I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? Without mentioning Cain's murderous violence, the question, where is Abel, your brother, comes to him as a gracious invitation to repentance and repair. Cain shamelessly refuses its underlying premise of responsibility and models not only the we knew nothing of the extermination camps, but also the send them back where they came from. This is our country. That sounds just like Cain. If they aren't smart enough to get rich from oil, fracking, and coal, too bad for them. In the face of such attitudes, rampant in Europe and North America, only a robust solidarity, enacting our answer to Cain, can begin to solve the problems of climate justice. We can make common cause with romantics who love the earth and its many species. I do myself as a native Oregonian. But fundamentally, we must find ourselves as our others' keepers. We can remember here also the African ethics of Ubuntu, well explained by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who writes, a person with Ubuntu is open and available to others, affirming of others, does not feel threatened when others are able or good. Knowing that he or she belongs in a greater whole and is diminished when others are humiliated or diminished, when others are tortured or oppressed. So what can we not conclude? Clearly, the radical ethics we have been discussing cannot help either psychotherapists or international public policy experts to decide the best road to climate justice. You know, there are all kinds of proposals, cap and trade, and, you know, on and on and on and on. But radical ethics doesn't tell us how to choose about that. Doesn't tell us how to move the seemingly unmovable forces of power and money arrayed against climate justice. These same power systems forbid us to associate climate change and its effects with social justice. We must look to the wisdom accumulated by those who overturned apartheid, or organized the civil rights movement, and finally brought the Vietnam War to a close, as well as to our partners in the indigenous communities so affected by climate devastation, to find our way. Radical ethics does not provide rules, strategies, or political philosophy and structures. Instead, it confronts each and all of us with our responsibility without beginning and without end, inescapable for our world and for each other. Radical ethics means we cannot go on as we did yesterday, self-satisfied that we are doing our best and or shifting our personal responsibility onto the system. The terrified faces of the destitute refugees, of those whose homes are being turned into desert or going beneath the sea, threatened by violence, forbid me to sleep comfortably and command me to respond. Every day I must allow them to persecute me, to pull me out of my comfortable life, to make me non-indifferent. For everybody, each person, the response will take its own form. People often ask me, well, what can I do? And I always say, well, do something. You can't do everything. Yeah, but there are so many places to do something. You pick whatever piece of this enormous problem that touches you and start working on it, whatever it is. So a radical ethics differs from other similar ethics like those who are giving us a list of what we have to do. It never begins and never ends. The face of the suffering other demands response from me before any agreement ever made. Yes, I am my other's keeper. And this responsibility continues. I more than all the others, as both Dostoevsky and Levinas repeatedly wrote. And for the extreme situation in which we once again find ourselves, perhaps only the ethic of hyperbolic responsibility can shake us out of our complacency. If not to save our own skin, still comfortable enough. Am I not my sisters and brothers' keeper? So that's the story I have to tell you. It isn't beautiful, but I think it's urgent. And I'd love to hear what your impressions and questions and reactions and whatnot and supplements to what I've said would be. Yeah, you want to start? I think there are several people. Go ahead.
Sure. I'm new to academia, but I've been a lifelong activist. And there is a tension in me about my steps currently because I see my responsibility to the whole. And doing a PhD, refocused my activities in a sort of what feels like self-centered way. I'm spending a lot of time learning. I believe that it's for the futuring of systemic justice that I'm doing this work, but at the same time, I was interested in a few points that you made. One was sort of an indictment of our chosen profession, right? In that we further the singularity of the one rather than the understanding of the collective. And I wonder if you might touch on how your awareness of this urgency, which I don't think is hyperbolic in any way, by the way, how that informs your practice. Because I have the sense that we need to carry the lens, right? That if, as you suggested, that we need to hold this in the top of our minds, the collective suffering and the collective move toward justice. And if we look at life that way, it will call us to the practice that leads to justice, right? And so I wonder if you could speak to how, are you a clinical practitioner?
I have been, here's disclosure. 30 years I worked full-time as a clinician, and now I am a so-called retired person. But I haven't, my community says that I failed retirement. It seemed to be pretty busy, but that's the minor thing. The more important, okay, no, but what I can say that may interest you is that there is a group based in England, but including more and more people from here, from this country, called Climate Psychology Alliance. And they're people who are, I think almost everybody in the group is a clinician, and who are very, very concerned about how overly singular, psychotherapy generally is, and how to think about working with people in extreme times. And I remember one time going to New Zealand, and they had just had an earthquake, an enormous earthquake in Christchurch that pretty much destroyed the town. And we were having a therapeutic conference, wonderful conference, half Maori therapists and half white therapists. It was absolutely extraordinary. And there were at least 10 or 12 therapists there from Christchurch, and nobody was saying anything about it. I mean, is as if this devastation hadn't just happened. So I at least invited them to come and talk about what it was like, because many of them suffered this earthquake while working with patients. They were sitting in their offices with patients when the earthquake came. And they really needed to talk about that and to try to make sense of what it is to go through something. I find that many of my colleagues tell me that in the current regime in this country, their patients bring up politics and such things a lot more. Some of the colleagues say that they just happen to have stuff about climate change in their waiting rooms that people are picking up, and some say nothing about it, and for some it has become something that gets woven in. But these are all just practical things. The more important issue is that, at least in the Freudian end of psychoanalysis, the political, social, and cultural have been pretty much systematically removed. And it has become about the individual. People like Erich Fromm, who were tremendously concerned about the political and the cultural, were shot out, heretics, sent them away. And Freud was pretty conservative himself. The leftists in his group, he was very suspicious about. So you will find that we really have to do some work to reintegrate our historical and cultural and climate context into our work. And I haven't got a list of ways to do it, but if any of you are interested in this kind of thing, you might want to look up Climate Psychology Alliance. And this is a group of wonderful, thoughtful, agonizing people. And we agonize together. I have things in my email every day from people here. It's an ongoing discussion. Individuals within the group are conducting courses and clinics and lectures and writings, and also are involved with something in London called Extinction Rebellion, where they all get out and close bridges down and things like that. So there's that kind of activism too. But most of the people are, we're all talking together about how do we get these things together? How do we get out of our little bubble?
The pretense that we are separate from one another is
Yeah.
part of the
Oh, of course, that's the big problem. Okay, somebody else want.
Yeah, like many, okay, like many people of my generation, my concern about climate change is less about my own welfare than about the impact and likelihood of not having an inhabitable planet for my children and succeeding generations. And I wonder if it's too much of a stretch, but that whether the kind of paralysis, denial, insensitivity that we exhibit in this area, that a kind of a trickle down effect to the young is feeding their own sense of hopelessness and cynicism, which then impacts them in other areas of their lives as well.
I would imagine yes. And when we get interested, I mean, seriously interested in this topic, they don't know what to make of us because they've never seen us like that. I gave a similar talk to what I gave you tonight to a group of college students in Colorado a year or so ago about 18 to 20-year-olds. And one young man stood up and said, "Why do you care about all this? You're going to be dead when all these bad things happen." And I just looked him in the eye and I said, "I have to care because of you." And he, oh, you know.
That's right.
Okay.
I had a couple of questions, but the first thing I'd like to talk about is that I appreciate your thoughts on this and your range of thoughts. But I think that it misdirected the audience for two reasons. One is, as scientists get more accurate, I don't consider that bad. That's good news. So in other words, as you say,
Okay.
15 years
Yes.
ago, it's like this. It's like going to my cardiologist. Your cholesterol was okay for 1988, but for 2005, it's a little too high. For 2015, it is very high. Okay, but here's the problem with that. Just to kind of bring it down.
Oh, yeah,
So
no,
we clear it
I
up.
get your point and I like it. Yeah.
So right now, in 1988, we didn't invent logostatin. Statin drugs, most criminals had a lot of them. One of the things I think failed to talk about, and I would like to hear the thoughts on it, is that how society reconceptualizes itself to confront different problems. Much the same way the Romans had to confront getting conquered by Visigoths and Huns. This is not an impossible task, by the way. At one time, we thought we could be better than horse shit. People were going to have to compete for 2 horses in every garage and how to make your wooden wheels work a little bit. We got through that. The other problem we had is that at one point in the colonial America, we were going to run out of trees. We were going to run fucking out of trees. There wasn't going to be a tree to burn, to cook your deer, cook your bear, or do anything else. So let's take a look at the cultural problem. She's right. The good doctor is absolutely right. We've got a couple of concepts that are core concepts. Now, I'm not a psychoanalyst, but I know a little bit about philosophy. So the question here, doctor, is I would like to hear your thoughts on the process of reconceptualizing the idea of our core concepts so we can move on to a new paradigm, like Thomas Kuhn or Michael Porganic. Can you talk about that a little?
You know, this is really, you do it in a humorous way, but this is a serious question. And it is, of course, what we need to do, and a previous speaker alluded to it. The most basic idea is shifting from conceiving ourselves as individuals to conceiving ourselves as intrinsically and intricately related to each other, so that if you're doing well, it's good for me. And if you're doing, you know, so that we're connected. The idea that we are fundamentally and intricately connected and our well-being depends on each other. That's, I mean, yes, we have, and that's not that's certainly not the philosophy of this country. We're the lonesome cowboy crowd. You know, this is we are culturally not there. And we need a philosophical shift that pushes a cultural shift. I agree with you entirely that this is what we need to do. The question is, how do we do it fast?
I mean, going to Ron's point about a paradigm shift, I was struck by I don't know if I have the quote right, from Levinas, that there has to be no distinction between those close and those far off. And when you said that, it brought to mind the statement that David Hume once made, that he's more pained, this is going to be offensive to some, but it's what he said, he's more pained by pricking his little finger than he fears of the death of 10,000 Orientals in the typhoon. And in a way, he was making a point about the human subject, about human nature. When we see, and let alone pricking your little finger, when a loved one has cancer, or you yourself become ill, where does climate change fit into your consciousness at that point? And where does it fit into the consciousness of people who themselves are struggling economically or struggling with other things? And the move from that egocentric predicament to one in which we actually see the far off person as if they are ourselves seems to be like such a radical change to me in the nature of human subjectivity. Maybe psychoanalysts have a way of canceling that, but it doesn't seem to me that simply the ethical appeal will do.
And I'm sure you're right. Simply the ethical appeal won't do it. That's why the prophets got killed and nobody listened to them. You know, I mean, it's the same sort of thing. They're telling us disaster is coming and it's because of your sins and so on. And this is essentially that kind of message. And that doesn't, what that usually evokes is, let's kill the prophet.
But what you're describing is a failure of empathy. I mean, when you talk about, I'm more upset about my finger than 10,000, it's because I have failed to see myself in those 10,000 and their families and their children. And to me, this is kind of hard not to equate the other with self. That's why I feel so stressed about being in a PhD program when I should be doing something. But don't you think?
Well, yes and no.
Its job that empathy would be grown such that I learn from my suffering to see you in your suffering and to reach out a hand. Don't you think, if we're doing our jobs?
Well, yes. I mean, I think, and if we're doing our job as parents, if we're doing our job as therapists, if we're doing our job as teachers, whatever all of us are, that we hope that the way that we treat the other, spreads empathy, if you will, or spreads the capacity to feel for the other. Nevertheless, I think what you're saying is a little bit to the side of that. And in the following way, if I prick my finger, that is so immediate to me, or if I smash it in a door, for example, the immediate pain is so that I can't think about any big picture. Or if you wrench your back or something, whatever thing befalls you in that moment. But that doesn't mean that you won't recover your ethical sensibility or recover your capacity to feel outraged at the separation of children from their parents at the border or something like that, just because you have a minute of that hurts. That's I think that that we can have both and with that, the immediacy of personal pain and experience. You want Ruth, Ellen? Oh yeah, let's give you the mic, yes.
In the days that I was doing a lot of group relations work, in the days that we were doing a lot of group relations work, one of the things that we talked about a lot was kind of the inevitability of hatred and war. Because, and again, following the system psychodynamic approach, even as far back as civilization and its discontents, the notion that all civilizations find another to project its negative stuff on and then hate them and fight them and to prevail only to have to split again. That this has been the course of human history. And so then we would ask ourselves and each other, well, what can we do about that? And the thinking then was that the only solution to this was if we got invaded by Martians. Then, you remember this thinking? And then everybody would have to get together and stop our own battles to fight the Martians.
At least temporarily.
Well, depending on how
How it
hardy
went.
the, yeah,
So
it
wait, let's
went.
find another enemy.
Yeah, until we find another enemy. Okay, so following that logic, isn't climate change like the invasion of the Martians? I mean, this is something that affects all of us equally, no matter who we are and where we are.
It doesn't affect all of us equally. That's the point.
Well, it maybe not right this moment, but when you talked about the person who wrote about mourning our planet, this does affect. I was very moved by that. I hadn't thought about that. But anybody who thinks about it thinks that this is very much a shared catastrophe. And we can make those separations. But the fact of the matter is, all of us are going to suffer. So why don't we get together? I mean, why do we maintain this illusion that some people will be suffering more than others? Why not frame it as this is a shared suffering that we all have to come together to fight? And that's what I want.
I would certainly agree that that is what needs to happen. But experientially, there are already people whose lives are completely devastated. Certainly, the town of Paradise up north there, and the people in the hurricanes and the typhoons and which are all more extreme than they ever were before. There are people who are already completely devastated, and it seems to be hard for us in the first world, for the most part, or who don't live in those precise places, to catch on that this is about all of us, that it's coming to all of us. And if we did, and if we even really and truly cared about those who are already being so badly hurt, Paradise is a town of not very affluent people. What if it had been Santa Barbara that burned down? Yeah, well, yes, but not to the extent that happened to Paradise. It was pretty bad what did happen. Oh, I know.
Yeah. Yeah, I would just reinforce that this is, I always think about the Titanic. This is the folks who are riding in steerage are the first to go. And part of what it does is it reinforces the denial and the delusion that the more privilege you have, you're actually going to be able to escape the consequences of this. And I know that people believe this, and it's historically been done. This brings me back to my Marxist intellectual roots, where, this is right out of, ruling class playbook. You exploit the contradictions within the culture, and they're really reliable. Sex, class, and race. You keep those divisions going, you keep people at one another, and talk about not then joining together to figure out where the enemy really is. We're all fighting one another while people are making millions of dollars and ruining the planet. So the challenge is, to me, exactly what it was at the beginning of the 20th century, to find a way to heal our wounds along those lines, much as you were saying, especially around our legacy of around racism that continues to divide us. That if we can heal those wounds, we've got a shot at really seeing ourselves as being able to be unified against this common enemy. But we currently have leadership that is absolutely expert at exploiting these divisions and making them worse. So to me, that's part of what's taking the Titanic and really speeding up those engines.
I couldn't agree more. The Titanic image is being used a lot for this. Only right now we're arguing about which color to paint the deck chairs.
Two completely separate thoughts. One is that I'm not sure we're in denial, but I think there is some unconscious wish to actually destroy the planet. And I think if we think about that, it opens up other ways of thinking about it. Yeah, and we're angry. And, I think of Ortner's, women are to nature as men are to culture. And we've spent all of our time, whether we're men or women, acting like men, trying to make culture. And now that, excuse me, bitch has come back and said, no, you can't do that. I'm actually in control here. And so I think there's a lot of rage about it. And so the concept of mourning seems really, really important to get, so that we can actually do something rather than being angry. We have to mourn what we've done. And I think you mentioned that, and it might have been Jem Bendel's.
Yeah, I think the thing that is different about this from some of the other things is we can say that bad things befall us. A meteor hits our planet and blows us into forever. Bad things befall us. We get ill. We get, and we get old, which is just not bad, because if we didn't, we'd be dead. But the idea that this is a disaster that we created and are creating, and that we haven't thought seriously enough, to your point about the paradigm shift and all, about what are the underlying presuppositions about life and about what is valuable that have enabled us to create this disaster.
Speaking to your double-mindedness intention, this is very personal. In 1991, I was in the 11th grade, and I went to a conference for Future Formers of America on the coast of Louisiana. I was raised on the coast of Louisiana that was hit by Hurricane Rita and not Katrina. Rita came on the heels of Katrina. But in 1991, they played this video, Louisiana, we're going to wash you away. And they projected by the year 2020 to 2050, where I grew up, would not be there. So now, I'm 43, 44, actually. I forget my age because I lie about it all the time. But, we're my husband and I are like inheriting this property that is right on the coast. It's on the Gulf Coast, and it's not going to be there probably. And we don't have the funds to save this property. But then we're also like, our fathers and my husband make our living from oil and gas. And so it's kind of this tension of what's really ruined our immediate press of where I am is that the oil companies came in and tore up the coast to get the oil. And then also now we have global warming, which we do not deny, and we see the raising of the tides water. So it's like, I hear your double-mindedness and this tension, but I think unless you're in it, you don't see the press. And, we have a press. And then the other thing I was going to recommend this book called Trauma Stewardship, which I read. It's by Dranut Lipsky and Burke. And she has cases of people who work with trauma and how we inherit these stories. And so we have an obligation to do something about it. And not only she has trauma therapists like myself, but she has people who are working on climate change and how they're seeing the destruction of species and what that's like. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, we've got some more.
Thank you, Dr. Orange. Excellent talk. I've been studying this my entire professional career, both in the academy and then working in nonprofits. And I was surprised by two things in your essay or in your talk tonight, mostly by their absence and by their presence. So I'm sure you've covered it in other writings, but I'm very curious about how you have provided a counter argument for the scholars and the politicians that argue that there are always technological solutions available. I think of the Julian Simon cornucopian argument that the carrying capacity of the planet is infinite, and here's why, right? And they lay that out, that a little bit like what Ron was saying, we'll always come up with some solution because we're inventive and creative and all those things. I'm curious about how you counter that in terms of the ethical framework. And then secondly, I'm curious about where you stand on other species, because there are times that I can say, it's fine with me. Humanity's not going to make it, whether we're angry at the planet or whatever is happening, it's too late for us, but at least the planet will recover. And then I think about all the species that we've extinguished, as well as other peoples, and all of the species that are going to die as a result of this. And I think, where are they and where are their voice? How do we give voice to those voiceless? And I saw that you had mentioned that in one of your writings. So I'm curious about what you're thinking along those lines.
Well, I'm of two minds about that last point. One is that if solidarity with the species that are being destroyed can help us to get activated to do something about all of this, then that's fantastic. And I think depending on lots and lots of factors, we humans are very variable about this. Some people could only get to care about climate change through their love for the diversity of species and for the beauty. And so that there's no way that I want to just eclipse that and put it away. There are, but there are those who argue that the most urgency, the most ethical urgency can come from concentrating on the most devastated human beings. And if that's the way that we can get activated, then I think that's the way we have to do it and call it that. I'm at this point, I am not ready to choose about that. I want us to grasp this thing however we need to grasp it. Now, the other thing you said about, is there not infinite creativity available to cope with this problem? There probably is if we would do it. If we would take it seriously enough to engage vast, both economic and creative resources in the service of making this difference. I mean, look at this Green New Deal that's that has been brought up just now. Out of the 600 climate organizations in this country, all but 5 of them signed on to the Green New Deal. The 5 that didn't are great big organizations with ties to the fossil fuel industry, like the Sierra Club, I'm sorry to say. I'm not ready to give up yet. I do believe that we have the resources to at least limit the damage to something that may be bearable, may be livable, but I don't see us doing it. Every day that goes by with the current situation is devastatingly lost time, as I see it now. Did I respond to the, yeah, okay. Sure. Oh, you didn't get to, yes.
So I think as psychologists, we might have a more proximal problem than changing climate. I understand there's a huge literature coming out of Sweden about young people who are experiencing PTSD, panic attacks, depression, etc., about climate. And they're blaming their parents, and they're presenting to psychologists with these problems. I think that hasn't come to us yet. They don't have huge disasters happening over there, except for that they're dark most of the day. So I don't know. I think that we need to, I hearken back to Shell's concern about the young people.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a bigger and bigger concern as time goes on. There was the one Swedish girl who sat outside of her school and refused to go to school until her country did something or other.
I wanted to say I really enjoyed your talk, and I feel like it starts not only at home, but it starts in the young, grade school, middle school, high school, college, even the PhD program, where we're teaching our kids to appreciate nature and to work towards their career and be competitive and to, okay, how we're going to survive and take care of ourselves. Well, we need to also teach them how to take care of our environment. And when we take care of our environment, when we're teaching them how to take care of our environment, we also should teach them that, instead of being so competitive, one teach one, each one teach one type of philosophy. And when we do that, we're teaching them to care for one another, not just saying, okay, I'm going to excel better than you, or I'm going to get in the best college better than you, or I'm going to get the better job better than you. We should teach them how to be more collaborative and, like you're saying, collective instead of more individualistic. And when we begin to teach our children that, and they begin to teach in the colleges that, instead of always being competitive with one another and helping one another, we'll understand the appreciation of taking care of one another.
Thank you so much for that. I think that is exactly the paradigm shift that we're trying to talk about. It couldn't have been, if we're going to be competitive, save it for sports, is the way I've always said to myself. I don't want to be a competitive person in my personal life or in my professional life. That's for collaboration, and we'll achieve so much more together. I'm so glad you said that. Yes.
I'm probably not the best person to ask this question, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. I'm a big follower of Krishnamurti, and it's I don't know if you know Jiddu Krishnamurti, and he talks about fragmentation. And I do understand what you were saying about, everybody was talking about coming together, we're connected, but it seems like, are we truly going to say more it's about connecting to the earth? That, let's be honest, a lot of us are not going to connect, and we all have our different viewpoints. We're disconnected because of governments and whatnot. So, from what I'm asking is, do you think it's better for us to connect with the earth, saying that this is our home, right? And that, we have all these differences, like you may live in that room and you may do what you want to do there, right? And your room is messy, but still this is the house and we need to fix the foundation. So what's your thought on connecting to the earth versus connecting to each other?
I don't think it's versus. I think that if we connect to each other, we can connect to the earth. And if we are really connected to the earth in the way that you're talking about, we will also be a brother and sister. I think this is just what we cannot, but strategically and personally, we each have to latch on to this problem wherever we can. And if it's out here, it might be something about the beaches and the oceans that would really, really move people. And someplace else, it's going to be the farming methods that are destroying so much. It's going to be a different thing for each person, how they would connect to the earth, but we'll do so much better and so much more if we try to do it together. A bunch of little individual efforts could be put together and really make more difference. But the other thing about what I was trying to say before is that why I should connect to the earth is for the sake of that baby that was here before. For the sake of the children, for the sake of each other. So that even if I'm 75 years old, which I will be next month, I need to worry about what's going to happen to you who are not yet 75, I think. Oh, you're looking good, man.
So just kind of expanding on what you just said, I think that's important because when we talk about the individual versus the collectivist culture, and the reality is within a certain aspect, we have a little bit of collectivism in the States because when we look at where we are within our own races, right? But I think that you touched on something very specific because in an individualistic culture, it's about me, but looking at the generations that come after me. And so if I cannot see or be my brother's keeper from another culture somewhere across the world, at least if maybe I can look at my grandchild or my great-grandchild. So for some people where it's about me, that is an extension of me. And so it may start there. If you were to look at an extension of you, what do you want for that extension of you?
And where do I draw the circle around myself of what matters? Yeah. That and how can that circle include your children and grandchildren? In my concern, yes. I am so impressed that after long days and days of work, what I've been told you folks have been doing this week, that you most everybody stayed and got engaged in this. This is so. What a wonderful community you have. I didn't know you before. I really thank you for the evening together.